Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Grandmaster Knockout. In the left corner, the only Dubov, and his opponent, ladies and gentlemen, Niemann. Tonight, one board, 64 squares, playing white. Dubov, playing black. Niemann, gentlemen, let the battle begin. Dubov, pawn to e4. Niemann, pawn to e5. Dubov, knight to c3. Niemann, knight to c6. Dubov, pawn to g3. Niemann, pawn to g6. Dubov, bishop to g2. Niemann, bishop to g7. Dubov, knight to g2. Niemann, pawn to d6. Dubov, pawn to d3. Niemann, knight to g7. Dubov, pawn to h4. Niemann, pawn to h6. Dubov, bishop to e3. Niemann, knight to d4. Dubov, pawn to f3. Niemann, pawn to c5. Dubov, knight to b1. Niemann, pawn to d5. Dubov, knight to d2. Niemann, bishop to e6. Dubov, pawn to h5. Niemann, pawn to g5. Dubov, pawn to c3. Niemann, knight takes e2. Dubov, queen takes a 2. Niemann, pawn to d4. Dubov, bishop to f2. Niemann, queen to b6. Dubov, knight to c4. Niemann, queen to a6. Dubov, bishop to h3. Niemann, pawn to b5. Dubov, bishop takes a 6. Niemann, queen takes a 6. Dubov, knight to a 3. Niemann, pawn to a 6. Dubov, pawn to c4. Niemann, castles kingside. Dubov, pawn to g4. Niemann, rook to fb8. Dubov, castles kingside. Niemann, bishop to f8. Dubov, rook to fc1. Niemann, knight to c6. Dubov, pawn to b3. Niemann, queen to d6. Dubov, knight to b1. Niemann, knight to d8. Dubov, knight to d2. Niemann, knight to e6. Dubov, knight to f1. Niemann, knight to f4. Dubov, queen to d1. Niemann, pawn takes c4. Dubov, rook takes c4. Niemann, pawn to a5. Dubov, knight to g3. Niemann, pawn to a4. Dubov, knight to f5. Niemann, queen to d7. Dubov, rook to b1. Niemann, pawn takes b3. Dubov, pawn takes b3. Niemann, rook to a 2. Dubov, king to f1. Niemann, knight to e2. Dubov, bishop to e1. Niemann, knight to f4. Dubov, bishop to g3. Niemann, knight to e2. Dubov, bishop to e1. Niemann, queen to a 7. Dubov, rook to c2. Niemann, knight to f4. Dubov, bishop to g3. Niemann, rook to a 3. Dubov, bishop takes f4. Niemann, pawn takes f4. Dubov, rook to c4. Niemann, queen to b6. Dubov, king to e2. Niemann, king to h7. Dubov, rook to b2. Niemann, rook to ba8. Dubov, queen to c2. Niemann, rook to a1. Dubov, rook to a4. Niemann, rook takes a 4. Dubov, pawn takes a 4. Niemann, queen to a 5. Dubov, rook to b1. Niemann, rook takes a 4. Dubov, queen to b3. Niemann, pawn to c4. Dubov, queen to b7. Niemann, pawn takes d3, check. Dubov, king to f1. Niemann, queen to a 7. Dubov, queen to d5. Niemann, pawn to d2. Dubov, king to g2. Niemann, rook to a 2. Dubov, king to h3. Niemann, rook to a 5. Dubov, queen to d8. Niemann, queen to a 8. Dubov, queen to f6. Niemann, queen to e8. Dubov, rook to b7. Niemann, rook takes f5. Dubov, pawn takes f5. Niemann, king to g8. Dubov, queen takes d4. Niemann, queen to c8. Dubov, rook to d7. Niemann, queen to c1. Dubov, king to g2. Niemann, queen to e1. Dubov, queen takes d2. Niemann, queen to g3, check. Dubov, king to f1. Niemann, queen takes f3, check. Dubov, king to g1. Niemann, bishop to c5, check. Dubov, king to h2. Niemann, queen to g3, check. Dubov, king to h1. Niemann, queen to g1, checkmate. Niemann delivers the finishing blow. Dubov is down. If you love this fight, smash that like button and subscribe. More legendary battles are coming your way. See you in the next one.